Austin, Texas, January 1861. Cynthia Ann Parker stares blankly at the new limestone buildings that line Congress Avenue and clutches her infant daughter closely. It has been more than a month now since her life has been turned upside down. When she had been taken from her home, her husband had been murdered and her 2 young sons had disappeared. This is the second time in the young woman's tragic life that such a fate has befallen her. As a young child, her family had been murdered, and she and her brother had been kidnapped. Now, she and her daughter, a sweet-natured baby girl named Prairie Flower, ride in a carriage making its way north toward the new Capitol building. They have been brought here by Cynthia Ann's uncle, a well-known Texan named Isaac Parker. An entrepreneur and politician, he and the entire Parker clan have searched for Cynthia Ann since she was taken decades ago from the family's frontier homestead. Isaac, a personal friend of Texas Governor Sam Houston, has brought Cynthia Ann and Prairie Flower here to beseech the Texas legislature to grant a stipend to the unfortunate young mother and daughter. The money is justifiable assistance, he insists, for a daughter of Texas who has suffered so greatly for so long. Silas walks Cynthia Ann and Prairie Flower into the Capitol building, where they are presented to the legislature, and Silas makes a heartened appeal that the state might have charity upon these unfortunate citizens. But Cynthia Ann does not speak English. She sees the impassioned speech of her uncle and the discerning eyes of those present in the Capitol, and surmises that the issue being debated is whether or not she and her daughter should be put to death. Terrified, she squeezes Prairie Flower tight to her chest and makes a desperate sprint for the looming doors of the Capitol. She is quickly, though gently, restrained and brought back to the chamber, where it is made clear to her what the actual nature of these proceedings involve. Eventually, Silas Parker's request will be granted. The Texas legislature approves a $100 a year payment for the term of 5 years to be paid to Cynthia Ann Parker. But for now, this all means nothing to Cynthia Ann. She is taken from the Capitol to a local photographer shop where a tintype is produced of her and Prairie Flower. In the tintype, an early form of photograph made by creating a direct positive on a sheet of thin metal known as a tin, Cynthia Ann sits tight-lipped and morose. She wears a striped skirt, a cotton blouse, and a wool robe with a clasp at the neck. Her daughter suckles at her exposed right breast, wrapped snugly in a dark blanket. The fatigue in her mother's eyes, after the distressing visit to the Capitol and suffering several hours of gawking by the 1860s Austinites, is palpable even more than a century and a half removed. It is the look of someone utterly miserable and utterly lost. Though she is indeed the stock of one of Texas's most notable families, Cynthia Ann does not know or care to know them. She does not consider herself, nor her daughter, to be a Texan nor an American, and she has no interest in adopting their culture or way of life. She does not, in fact, even assent to the name bestowed upon her by these blustery, industrious folk who seemed awash in their own foolery. Simply hearing the name Cynthia Ann causes her a visceral reaction of anger and revulsion. This is because, in her mind, she is the farthest thing from a Texan. She, for the last 30 years of her life, has existed as a member of the native tribe that all Texans feared more than any other, the Comanche. She has been known as Nautda, or someone found. She had lived a hard life, but a free life, on the ranges of the open prairie that most Americans, even most Texans, would only ever read about. She had been the wife of a chief, a strong, powerful man named Peta Nocona. She had been the mother of not only Prairie Flower, but 2 young boys who were the apples of her eye. The younger son, a boy named Peanuts, was kind and introspective. His older brother, however, was more serious, more assertive, and more circumspect. Only a few summers before, his mother had scolded and whipped him after the temerarious youngster had demanded that a visiting elder give him some of the buffalo meat that he had been allotted for his supper. The piece that he had been given, the 7-year-old boy coolly observed, was much smaller in comparison, and this was inherently unfair. His mother had beaten him and shoved the extra meat down his throat as punishment for disrespecting an elder guest. However, because of this headstrong nature, his mother had also always believed him destined for great things. His name was Quanah. But scarcely a month later, all that had come to a sudden, violent end. On December 19th of 1860, a detachment of Texas Rangers led by Captain Sol Ross crashed into their village, just outside the present-day town of, aptly enough, Quanah, Texas. Everything had happened in a flash, but to the best of her knowledge, Cynthia Ann's husband and 2 sons had been killed in the attack. The Rangers had taken Cynthia Ann alive and quickly surmised that she was, in fact, the legendary missing white girl who had been taken from Parker's fort in 1836, when her own family had been killed by the Comanche. Now, here she sat, in Texas's capital city, having her photograph made. After the tintype and political pleadings are complete, the Parkers leave Austin and return to Silas's home in Birdville, Texas, northeast of Fort Worth. For the following several years, she and Prairie Flower will live with various members of the Parker family. However, Cynthia Ann remains miserable, completely unwilling and largely unable to adapt to her new lifestyle and surroundings. In 1864, the toddler Prairie Flower would succumb to influenza. Completely heartbroken and seemingly utterly alone, Cynthia Ann would continue to deteriorate, mounting a number of failed escapes. Each time, she would be brought back in a state of even greater misery and despair. In 1871, she began to refuse to eat and drink. There seemed to be nothing left in this life for her. In March of that year, she would finally pass away, it would seem, of a broken heart. As the bluebonnets began to bloom in 1871, poor Cynthia Ann Parker was laid to rest in Foster Cemetery near Pointer, Texas, outside of Fort Worth. She died believing her husband to be dead and her sons to be lost to the vast emptiness of the wilds. But Cynthia Ann was only partly right in these assumptions. Her husband, the warchief Peta Nocona, had indeed, at least by most accounts, been killed in the fight with the Rangers. However, her 2 young sons, Quanah and Peanuts, had not. They had survived a harrowing ordeal, finding themselves alone and with no supplies in the middle of a vast expanse of frontier that had seen countless settlers perish under its merciless conditions. It was the middle of December, and the boys had to travel hundreds of miles without food or reliable water sources, all while being pursued by the Rangers. They would have to do all of this under the auspices of assuming both parents, as well as the rest of their friends and relatives, had just been killed. Though accounts of what would come to be known as the Battle of Peasy River vary, the Ranger attack on the village amounted to more of a massacre of mostly women and children and elderly Comanche than it did any actual pitched battle between comparable belligerents. H.B. Rogers, a ranger who participated in the fight, related the following reflection in his memoirs. "I was in the Peasy River fight, but I am not very proud of it. That was not a battle at all, but just a killing of squaws. 1 or 2 bucks and 16 squaws were killed. The Indians were getting ready to leave when we came upon them." A contingent of the Rangers pursued the 2 boys seen fleeing on the back of 1 horse, following them for 2 days and nights. Neither of the youngsters were of age to hunt or make war, but their upbringing as future Comanche warriors had prepared them well for this unfortunate scenario. They were indeed able to make it all the way to the nearest Comanche village, some 75 to 100 miles to the west. The camp was a very large collection of several villages that had coalesced for the winter in a canyon near the base of the Llano Estacado, Texas's vast expanse of staked plains. The 2 traumatized youngsters had rushed into the camp, causing a calamitous uproar when they reported the catastrophes of the last few days. All of their village had been killed, they said, and overrun by a force of 10,000 Rangers. This was, of course, a wildly exaggerated claim driven by the boys' adrenaline. While many of the adult Comanche likely knew this, they also knew that if even a fraction of the boys' estimates proved to be true, their village could suffer the same fate. This band of Comanche, roughly 1,000 strong, broke camp as quickly as possible and made their way north, with Quanah and Peanuts in tow, where they wintered in the Wichita Mountains in present-day Oklahoma. For the next several years, the boys would carry on their lives with the Comanche on the high plains. However, their lives were now drastically different from the existence they had known previously. They had both grown up as the sons of a well-respected chief, and though they were known to be half-white because of their mother's adopted status in the tribe, they were still afforded a great measure of comfort and autonomy. However, as orphans, they found themselves often existing on the fringes of their culture. Quanah would later recount that, "We were often treated very cruelly, as orphans of only Indians are treated." Within a few years, Peanuts would be dead, though his cause of death is unknown. This left Quanah now bereft of family, legacy, and seemingly of hope. Again, quoting Quanah's personal recollection of the time, "It seemed then to me that I was left friendless. I had to beg for my food and clothes, and would scarcely get anyone to make or mend my clothes. I at last learned that I was treated more cruelly than the other orphans on account of my white blood." However, despite all of this, Quanah had burgeoned from a frightened and destitute youth to a powerfully built young warrior. Quanah's father, Peta Nocona, as well as his grandfather, the legendary Comanche warchief Iron Jacket, had been large, imposing men. So too had his mother's family, with the Parkers being known as sturdy Scotch-Irish stock. His great-grandfather, John Parker, who had been killed on the day Cynthia Ann had been taken by the Comanche, had fought in the Revolutionary War as a member of the Continental Army. Though orphaned and impoverished, Quanah, whose name has been translated to mean anything from fragrance to stink, was still the physical sum of his genetic components, and by the age of 15, he had become a full-fledged warrior who stood almost a head taller than his cohorts and possessed a massive upper body musculature still evident in photos taken 50 years later. He possessed a powerful, discriminating intellect as well as a propensity for leading men in battle. Though circumspect and discerning in his day-to-day life, in battle he seemed to possess a reckless abandon in regard to his own safety, and, perhaps more than any of his fellow Comanche warriors, he possessed a deep, abiding hatred for whites. By the late 1860s, as his mother withers away under the care of relatives he has never met, Quanah Parker is on his way to becoming a war chief, and the Comanche are running rampant over the whole of Texas. And now, at the same time Cynthia Ann attempts to escape time and again and is literally dragged back into the homes of various Parker relatives, her beloved son sits around a campfire with other warriors, listening to 3 elder chiefs detail their plans for an upcoming raid. This camp, staked far out on the expanses of the Llano Estacado, is a coalescence of several Comanche bands. Quanah has grown up with the Nocona, but by the late 1860s is spending more and more time with the Quahati band. The chief of the band he is now with is a man named Bear's Ear. He now addresses the group of warriors, detailing his plan to raid deep into the territories of the East, stealing all of the horses that they can, and killing anyone who seeks to stop them. Comanche recruitment for warfare is still conducted as a relatively democratic affair, with war chiefs possessing only as much power as the raiding parties they are able to assemble are willing to grant them. This group of warriors, though, readily agrees to the plan. They have honed their skills in raiding, pillaging, and killing in the preceding few months, ravaging homesteads throughout central Texas. In a culture where one's social ascension is based on their martial prowess, these young men are all too eager to exact retribution on the intruders while simultaneously building their respective fortunes and reputations. They make ready and break camp the next day, heading due east over the rolling Texas plains. At perhaps the same moment, Cynthia Ann's well-meaning but frustrated relatives are scolding her yet again for cutting her hair short as part of the traditional Comanche grieving process. Her eldest son is on his way to wreak havoc upon the Texan settlements north of Fort Worth. Comanche raiding has been so fierce and so prevalent in the preceding few years, the line of settlement has receded further back to the east than it was only a decade earlier. At this time in the late 1860s, it's estimated that there are less than 5,000 total members of the Comanche tribe still living free on the plains. However, what they lack in numbers, the Comanche make up for in brutality. The standard Comanche raid saw all fighting-age males killed. all of the women killed outright, sexually abused, or both, and all children not old enough to be self-sufficient, summarily disposed of. These tactics had not only managed to forestall the advancement of American settlers for decades, they had, in fact, managed to drive them back. Thus, this raiding party must go further east than Quanah's father had to, only a decade before, in order to find the settlements that make up their quarry. They finally come upon several settlements near the present-day town of Gainesville, Texas, roughly 50 miles north of Fort Worth, and only 165 miles northwest of where Cynthia Ann Parker sits whiling away her tedious, lonely days. The raiding party manages to quickly accumulate a large herd of horses, so large that Bear's Ear decides they have enough to make their return trip. They push the large herd hard to the west, heading back to the relative security of the Llano Estacado. However, word has spread quickly to nearby Fort Richardson, near present-day Jacksboro, Texas, and a detachment of U.S. Army cavalrymen are already in pursuit of the raiding party. They finally catch up to the Comanche at the Red River, and a vicious fight ensues. Early in the battle, Bear's Ear is struck down by an Army bullet. As fire continues to rain down upon them, Quanah senses a collective despair amongst the Comanche ranks. The killing of a warchief is considered bad medicine and oftentimes seen as sufficient reason to abandon an engagement altogether. Quanah, however, seizes the opportunity and takes charge of directing his fellow warriors' actions. He yells at them to spread out and to turn the horses north to the river instead of continuing to move west. In the midst of a raging firefight, the Comanche managed to push a sizable horse herd into a 90-degree turn to the north and continue their egress onto the open plains. Quanah shouts exhortations and directives as the party crosses the river. However, he is closely pursued by a cavalry soldier who can tell that this young warrior is now the Comanche in charge and is thus now intent on killing him in hopes of ending the fight. The soldier gets close enough to fire at Quanah, but narrowly misses. Now enraged, the hulking young warrior quickly turns his horse and confronts the oncoming soldier head-on. He charges forward himself, with the two riders rapidly closing distance between each other and deliberately taking aim. The soldier fires again, grazing Quanah's thigh. A second later, Quanah looses his arrow, striking the soldier in the shoulder. Now disabled, the trooper drops his weapon and turns his mount, riding desperately back towards his own lines. Quanah, however, has no time to savor his micro-victory, as his charge has left him in an exposed position, making him a veritable sitting duck for Army sharpshooters. Quanah's Comanche warrior training kicks into high gear as he wheels his mount back towards his own lines. He urges the horse forward at full gallop as he deftly drops to the side of the animal, guarded from Army bullets. The charging steed plows into the Red River, with Quanah simultaneously diving in and crossing the river swimming side by side with his mount. Somehow, in a hailstorm of lead, both rider and horse remain unharmed and make it to the other side. The cavalrymen decide to proceed no further, as following the Comanche onto the open plains is tantamount to suicide. The raiding party makes its way north, and though slightly inconvenienced by the detour, they are more than impressed by the young Quanah's exploits that day. That night, Quanah is elected a war chief, and days later, the party makes their triumphant return. It is likely that Cynthia Ann, or at least the Parker family, have heard about the raiding going on north of Fort Worth, but they have no way of knowing that Quanah is among the raiders. Cynthia Ann would never know the fate of her young boys. Quanah would, however, learn what happened to his mother, and while he would never see her again, he always kept with him a copy of the tintype made that day in Austin. This, however, is just the beginning of the story of Quanah Parker. He would go on to become the last and greatest chief of the Comanche. The tales of his exploits and contributions to his people are legendary, as are the stories of his kinsmen who were killed in the massacre at Parker's Fort so many years before. The Parkers are among the most prominent families in Texas history, but their stories, as well as the stories of their descendant who became the great chief of the Comanche, are other stories for other times. Thank you for tuning into this episode of History at the OK Corral. Don't forget to click like, share, subscribe, and share this episode with a friend. And if you'd like to support our work, click the link in the description below to become a subscriber on Patreon. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time on History at the OK Corral, History Too Real for the Westerns.